It finally happened, the day we were all waiting for. Hikaru Nakamura, everyone's favorite, has now won his first game in the FIDE Candidates Tournament against none other than Alireza Firouzja. I'm gonna walk you through the game, so get some popcorn, get ready, and now we got Hikaru with the black pieces, Alireza with the white pieces, and he goes pawn to e4. We got pawn to e5 by Hikaru, knight to f3 attacking the pawn, knight to c6 defending it. Bishop to c4, this is an Italian opening, knight to f6 and pawn to d3 opening up this diagonal for the bishop on c1. Now we got bishop c5 by Hikaru and pawn to c3 by Alireza, preparing at some point a pawn push on d4 to fight for the center. Pawn to h6, avoiding some very annoying pins from the bishop on g5, pinning the knight on f6. Now we got pawn to b4 by Alireza attacking the bishop on c5, which goes all the way back to e7. Now we got queen to b3 by Alireza Firouzja, putting a lot of pressure on the pawn on f7, which is now only defended by the king on e8. Now Hikaru simply castles, and now the pawn is perfectly protected by the rook on f8. Now we got pawn to a4 by Alireza Firouzja and pawn to d6 by Hikaru Nakamura to open up this diagonal for the bishop on c8. Knight b to d2 by Alireza, and now Hikaru goes knight to b8, and now look at this. It looks like he has not developed anything on the queen side. And on the other hand, Alireza Firouzja has all this massive pawn storm on the queen side, all the pieces developed. And you might think that Alireza is better here, but this is just equal. It looks very scary, I know that, but Hikaru can very easily just finish the development in a couple moves. And now Alireza goes pawn to d4 and Hikaru takes the pawn on d4. Pawn takes d4 and pawn to a5 by Hikaru. e5 by Firouzja, now attacking the knight on f6, which goes to h5 now. Pawn to b5, restricting the movement of this knight on b8 a little bit. And now we got knight to f4 by Hikaru Nakamura, threatening to go pawn to d5, attacking the bishop on c4. So Firouzja goes pawn to g3, attacking the knight first. But Hikaru does not move the knight away, instead he goes pawn to d5. And if you take my knight, I will take yours and you will have double pawns. You don't have the bishop pair anymore, and that would simply be better a little bit for Hikaru Nakamura. So instead, Firouzja goes with the bishop all the way back to f1. Well, if you go to d3 or e2, you can simply be taken by the knight, so it has to go all the way back to f1. Now Hikaru goes with the knight to e6, bishop to g2 by Firouzja, putting the bishop on a little bit better diagonal, now putting a little bit of pressure on the pawn on d5, potentially with the bishop when you move the knight, and with the queen on b3. Now we get pawn to c6 by Hikaru Nakamura, Firouzja finally castles, and knight to d7, developing the minor pieces that have not been developed just yet. Bishop to b2, putting another defender on the pawn on d4, so this knight can freely move at some point. Now we get knight to b6 by Hikaru, Firouzja takes the pawn on c6, Hikaru simply takes back, and bishop to c3, putting a bit of pressure on the pawn on a4. Now we get pawn to c5 by Hikaru, fighting for the center, as he has now developed most of his minor pieces. Rook to b1, attacking this knight, and Hikaru goes rook to a6, defending it. If you think you can get rid of that rook by going bishop to f1, attacking the rook, there's simply pawn to c4, now attacking the queen. You have this passed pawn, the knight is still defended by the rook, and this is simply better for Hikaru. So instead of doing that, Firouzja simply takes the pawn on c5. Hikaru takes back with the bishop, now putting the bishop on a better diagonal, eyeing at the king on g1, and now Firouzja goes queen to b5. We have queen to c7 by Hikaru, and rook to c1, putting the rook on an x-ray with the queen on c7. So Hikaru moves the queen to a7, and now we have queen to e2 by Alireza Firouzja. Bishop to d7, developing the bishop, and bishop to f1, now attacking this rook twice with the queen and with the bishop, and the rook is only defended by the queen on a7. So you might think that this rook is trapped, you can't really move it anywhere, but you can block with the knight. You are sacrificing a pawn, but not really. See, if you take the knight with your knight, there's pawn to c4, and if you take the pawn again, the rook is attacked by the queen and by the bishop, but now the queen is not defending the pawn on f2. So there's bishop takes f2 with a check, you have to move your king, and then the rook can finally move, rook to c6, attacking the queen, and this is just way better for the black pieces. So instead of taking the knight on c4, Firouzja goes knight to b3, attacking the bishop on c5, which goes back to b6. You don't want to move this bishop out of this beautiful diagonal. You have to keep the queen defending the f2 pawn all the time, so you want to keep this bishop on this diagonal with the queen on a7. Now Firouzja goes rook to d1, attacking the pawn on d5, queen to a8, defending that pawn, and now we get bishop to g2, putting another potential attacker on the pawn on g5 once you move this knight out of the way. Now Hikaru goes knight to c5, knight takes c5, and bishop takes c5. Now Firouzja goes knight to h4, unlocking this attacker to the pawn. So Hikaru goes knight to b6, adding another defender to the pawn. bishop to d4, bishop takes d4, and rook takes d4. Now Hikaru moves the rook out of a6, so it is not attacked by the queen anymore, and you can simply move your queen without having to worry about that rook being undefended. Now we get pawn to h3 by Alireza Firouzja, rook to c7, and pawn to g4. Queen to c8, grabbing the open file, just forgetting about this pawn. Well, if you take the pawn, that's just fine, but Hikaru would just get a lot of activity. You have the open file, this bishop is doing great, and we can just bring the other rook into the game as well. Queen to d2 by Firouzja, very quietly attacking the pawn on a5, nobody noticed that, and then Hikaru goes rook to c5, defending that pawn, adding another defender to d5, and we get queen to f4 by Alireza Firouzja. And then we get knight to f5, beautiful move by Firouzja, trying to go knight to d6, forking the rook, forking the queen, and the knight on d6 is just way too annoying, so you don't want that to happen. And now Hikaru takes the knight on f5, of course, g takes f5, and queen to c7, putting pressure on the pawn on e5 with the queen and with the rook. So now Firouzja goes rook to d1, putting another defender, and we get knight to d7, putting yet another attacker, and that pawn cannot be defended anymore, so Firouzja goes pawn to e6. We get a queen trade, and now knight to f6 by Hikaru Nakamura. Now the rook goes back to d4, Hikaru simply brings the king a little bit closer, rook to d2, and pawn takes e6. Pawn takes e6 and king to e7, preventing this pawn from running any further. You don't want that pawn to get too far. Rook to b2, trying to go rook to b7 check, so Hikaru goes rook to c8, and now if you go rook to b7, we can simply block with the rook on c7. Bishop to f1 by Alireza Firouzja, simply putting the bishop on a better diagonal. You cannot stay here just attacking this pawn, as it is always defended either by the knight or by the rook on c5. And now we get knight to e4 by Hikaru. Bishop d3 now attacking the knight goes to c3, pawn to f4 and pawn to d4. Now Hikaru wants to push this pawn as far as he possibly can. Now we get rook to g2 by Alireza Firouzja, attacking the pawn on g7. And how would you defend that pawn? If you go rook to g8, that is the wrong answer. You would be putting your rook on a very passive square, and you never want to do that. Instead of doing that, Hikaru goes pawn to g5. And if you think that's a free pawn, think again. It is defended by the pawn on h6 and by the rook on c5. Now we get pawn to f5 by Firouzja and knight to d5 by Hikaru, trying to cause some trouble with knight to f4, attacking the rook, attacking the bishop, or so we thought. But then Alireza Firouzja goes rook to e4, now attacking the pawn on d4, and Hikaru decides to go the other way, knight to d4, attacking the bishop on d3. And now we get pawn to f6 by Alireza Firouzja, sacrificing the pawn to open up the f-file. King takes f6 and rook to f2. If you try to run away with the king, let's say to e7 or something, you would simply get killed by these two rooks and the bishop, king to e8 or something, bishop b5, and you're getting smashed. Instead, Hikaru Nakamura finds the best move, which is covering up with the rook to f5. We have rook takes f5 by Alireza Firouzja and king takes f5, and now Firouzja pushes the pawn, and it looks like you can't really stop the promotion. But now Hikaru takes the bishop on d3, pawn to e8, promoting to a queen. Of course, you have to take that, rook takes, and now this is a rook versus a knight and two pawns. This should be an easy draw for any super grandmasters, but the problem is that they are both super low on time. So it really comes down to who's better at blitz. Knight to f4 by Hikaru, threatening to push this pawn, threatening to take this one. Now Firouzja goes king to f1, we get pawn to d3, of course, king to f2, and now of course you take on h3 with a tempo on the king. The king goes to e3, now attacking the pawn on d3, and Hikaru goes pawn to g4. And now Firouzja thinks for a very long time, and the clock just ticks down all the way down to 30 seconds. And he makes the horrible blunder of taking the pawn on d3. This is a blunder because now Hikaru simply can push the g-pawn as far as he possibly can, and you can't really stop it with this rook. If you go rook to g8 trying to stop the pawn, you can simply just push it, and if you take the pawn, there's knight to f4 with a beautiful fork to end the game. So instead, Firouzja goes rook to f8 check, and after king to e6, Alireza Firouzja resents the game, and Hikaru Nakamura gets the first win in the candidates in 2024. In the other game of Gukesh versus Abasov, we have Gukesh with the white pieces, and this is a queen versus queen and pawn, very long and complicated endgame. The idea for Gukesh is to trade off the queens and then push this pawn to promote. And in this position, Abasov goes queen to f1 check, and that is a miss, that is a blunder that really cost him the game. Now Gukesh can simply block with the queen to f4, and after queen to b5, there's queen to e5, now putting the queen on an x-ray with the king on h5. Queen to d7 check by Abasov, and now we get king to f6 with a discovered check from the queen on e5. You have to move your king, and then queen to g5, and in this position, Abasov resigned the game, because you are forced to go king to h3, and now there's simply queen to f5, forking the queen and forking the king, you have to trade off the queens, and you really can't stop this pawn from promoting. Ian Nepomniachtchi saved the draw versus Praggnanandhaa today, and this was the final position. And then Fabiano Caruana was in big trouble against Vidit. That's right, Fabi was in trouble against Vidit, but he managed to get a threefold repetition and save the game with a draw. If you liked the video, make sure you subscribe and turn on the notifications, and I will see you tomorrow in the next round.